She was roughly pushed out of the restaurant like an unwanted nuisance. To the security guard, she was just an elderly black woman, unworthy of attention. He had no idea he was humiliating the mother of the restaurant's owner. When the truth came to light, the consequences shocked everyone who considered themselves superior. The events that followed would stun even the most jaded. But let's start from the beginning. If this story has touched you, leave a like and subscribe. Every voice helps in our shared fight against systemic racism and injustice. Mabel walked toward the restaurant, her heart swelling with pride for her son. Her gaze, though slightly clouded with age, gleamed with joy. The opening of this restaurant was a milestone for Jason, and she had always believed in his success, despite all the obstacles he had faced. As she passed by the bright signs, Mabel couldn't help but recall how her son had dedicated years to building his business in a city where opportunities for black entrepreneurs were scarce. Finally, the day had come, and she wouldn't miss the chance to step into the place he had built with his own hands. As she approached the restaurant, Mabel anticipated a warm welcome. She imagined a cozy atmosphere, the smell of freshly prepared food, and the smiling staff who would greet her as the owner's mother. However, before she could take a step inside, she was abruptly stopped by a harsh voice. A large man in a dark uniform frowned as soon as he saw her. "Hey, old lady, what are you doing here?" His voice was cold and harsh. Mabel froze. She wasn't used to being addressed like this at her age. She awkwardly smiled and stepped closer to the door. "I just wanted to come in." Her voice was calm, but there was a slight tremor in it. "Entrance is for customers only," the guard interrupted, looking her up and down with disdain. He didn't even bother to ask why she was there. To him it was obvious. She was an outsider. Mabel tried to explain that her son owned the restaurant, but the guard wasn't listening. He continued to block her path, eventually pointing her to the sidewalk and telling her to get lost before I call the police. Mabel felt a rising bitterness inside her. This guard saw her as just another elderly black woman, someone unworthy of being there. She stood before him, trying to maintain her composure, but his words cut her deeper than she expected. Once more, she attempted to explain. "Listen, I'm the owner's mother," she said, trying to sound confident, even though humiliation boiled within her. "The owner's mother?" The guard sneered, looking at her with open contempt. "You looked in a mirror lately? They don't serve people like you here." He stepped forward, pushing her further from the door. His face was full of scorn, as if he were tossing out an uninvited guest from someone else's party. To him, her words were a joke, a pathetic attempt to justify her presence. He didn't care who she was. In his eyes, she was just another black woman who didn't belong there. Mabel gripped her bag tighter, suppressing the flare of anger rising inside her. Her breathing grew heavier, but she worked hard to conceal any signs of weakness in front of him. She had faced enough prejudice in her life, and every time she learned to remain calm, even when burning inside with indignation. She spoke again, her voice firmer now. "You're mistaken. I'm not here to cause trouble, but I need to go inside." But the guard wasn't listening. In his mind, she had already assumed the role he had assigned her, unwanted and unworthy. He simply raised his hand and pointed to the street. "I said get out of here, or I'm calling the cops. You think I'm joking?" Mabel froze, realizing she was still standing at the doorstep of the restaurant her son had built with his own hard work. She looked around, noticing how others passed by without a second glance, paying no attention to what was happening. To them, it was just another ordinary morning, but for Mabel, it was a moment that reminded her of the cruel reality she had lived her entire life. She stepped back, feeling the old memories flare up in her soul, the ones she had tried so hard to forget. It was as if all the years of struggle and suffering came rushing back in an instant. Scenes from her youth flashed before her eyes. The times she had endured constant humiliation just because of the color of her skin. The days when signs reading, "Whites Only," hung on shop doors and cafes, when she was pushed away from tables and refused service, leaving scars she thought had long healed. She remembered how, in her youth, she had been thrown out of a diner just for sitting at the wrong table. Back then, there was nothing she could do but leave, swallowing her tears and inner rage. But over the years, she learned how to fight that pain. She strove to live with dignity, raising her children to know their worth, despite everything around them. Her son Jason had become exactly that. Strong, smart, ambitious, overcoming every obstacle to achieve his dream. She was more proud of him than anything in the world. But now, standing before this restaurant, she felt like that young girl again, being shoved out onto the street as if she didn't deserve even to step inside. Her heart clenched with bitterness, but she refused to back down. She was no longer the weak girl who silently accepted injustice. She was the mother of a successful businessman who had earned everything with his own hands, and she had every right to be here. Clenching her lips, Mabel lifted her head and took a step forward, locking eyes with the guard. Her voice rang out firmly. "I'm not going anywhere. If I have to, I'll wait here until my son arrives." The guard smirked, but something in her gaze made him pause momentarily. Mabel stood tall, as though this situation was yet another test on her path, and she wasn't going to yield to a man who didn't even try to listen to her. She remained in place, despite the guard's pressure, feeling the tension rising around her. Other restaurant patrons started gathering at the entrance, all of them white. They walked past her with ease, barely noticing her presence, as though she were invisible. Some cast quick glances her way, full of suspicion and disdain. These looks were all too familiar to her. The same looks she had received throughout her life, reminding her that she didn't belong. Soon, a manager approached the guard, a man in a suit with an expensive watch on his wrist. His face showed a mix of businesslike indifference and slight irritation at being interrupted. He glanced at Mabel with a look of judgment, then turned to the guard. "What's going on here?" he asked dryly, not addressing Mabel directly, as if she weren't even there. "She's trying to get in," the guard smirked. "Says her son owns the place. Funny, right?" The manager merely shrugged, not bothering to give Mabel even a moment's respect or understanding. To him, this was just another scene, another problem to be dealt with quickly so as not to disrupt the restaurant's operation. "Listen, ma'am," the manager said coldly, now addressing Mabel, though his voice carried no respect. "If you don't have a reservation or a valid reason for being here, I'm afraid you'll have to leave. This isn't a place for wandering." Mabel clenched her fists, feeling the anger rise in her once again. She took a deep breath, trying not to lose her composure. She wanted to shout, to explain that her son owned this restaurant and that she had every right to be here, but she knew that such words would do nothing. These people wouldn't see her as anything other than just another black woman who, in their minds, didn't belong. "I don't need a reservation," Mabel said firmly, but her words were ignored once again. The manager nodded to the guard. "Escort her away from the entrance, please. We've got a lot of customers today, and I don't want anyone feeling uncomfortable." The guard grinned and stepped forward, but Mabel didn't move. She stood her ground, no longer hearing their words or noticing their disdainful glances. Inside her burned the fire of all the decades when she and her generation endured such treatment, but she would no longer accept it. At that moment, Mabel realized they didn't just see her as an outsider. They had already decided she couldn't be anything more. To them, she was merely a reflection of the prejudice deeply ingrained in their minds. No words could convince them otherwise, because they didn't want to see the truth. Mabel stood firm, like a rock, when suddenly her gaze fell on a familiar figure approaching the restaurant. It was Jason, her son. Tall, confident, dressed in an elegant suit, he crossed the street with a phone in hand, talking to someone about business. In his stride was the strength she had always seen in him. To her, he was the embodiment of her hopes and all the sacrifices she had made for his future. But at that moment, all she cared about was that she needed his help. The guard didn't notice Jason at first, preoccupied with his continued efforts to pressure Mabel. He stepped closer to her, his hand already raised as if to grab her arm and lead her away from the restaurant. But at that moment, Jason saw what was happening. His eyes locked on his mother, then on the guard standing far too close to her. Jason, holding back his inner fury, walked confidently towards them. His face darkened as he realized what was happening outside his restaurant and to his own mother. "What the hell is going on here?" he asked loudly, his voice rumbling like thunder. The guard flinched in surprise, turning abruptly. "Sorry, sir," the guard began, not immediately realizing who was standing before him. "This woman, she's causing a disturbance, so we asked her to leave." "My mother is causing a disturbance." Jason spoke slowly, each word cutting through the air like a blade. The guard finally understood who was in front of him. His eyes widened in shock as he realized he was standing before the restaurant's owner, and the woman he had so rudely tried to eject was his mother. The manager, hearing who had intervened, also froze, his face paling as he hurriedly tried to correct the situation, stepping toward Jason with an apology. "Sir, this must be a misunderstanding. We just didn't know." But Jason cut him off, not hiding his anger. "Misunderstanding? You didn't even bother to listen to her." His voice rose a notch, drawing the attention of passers-by and other patrons. "This is my mother, and you both decided you had the right to treat her like this?" Mabel stood silently, watching her son. She knew Jason had always protected her, and this moment was no exception. But her pride in him was now mixed with deep disappointment. Once again, she had faced a reality where her skin color overshadowed everything else, even in a place where her family owned everything around them. Jason fell silent, his gaze shifting between the guard and the manager. His face showed anger, but beneath it lay something deeper. Profound disappointment that so many people, even in the modern world, still judged others by the color of their skin. The manager, still trying to explain, spoke again. "Sir, we didn't know she was your mother. If we had known..." "If you had known?" Jason leaned in slightly, his voice icy. "So if it had been someone else's mother, or just an ordinary woman, you'd still feel entitled to humiliate her? Is this your approach to work? Judging people by how they look?" The guard now stood with his head lowered, not daring to meet Jason's eyes. The manager, stumbling over his words, began to stammer. No, sir. I meant that, of course not. We were just trying to maintain order." "Order?" Jason was on the verge of exploding. "You call racism order?" His words caused a murmur among the people who had gathered nearby, watching the scene unfold. Some were already holding up their phones, recording the incident. Jason realized that this situation was more than just an ordinary conflict. This was a moment that could exemplify what was happening all over the country. The everyday acts of discrimination that had long remained in the shadows, but could no longer be ignored. Mabel stood by, watching her son, and in her chest, a sense of pride swelled again. Despite the anger and pain she felt, she saw how her son was turning this moment into something greater. He wasn't just defending her. He was challenging the system that had oppressed people like her for years. "I want both of you gone," Jason said calmly but firmly. "Immediately. There's no place for people like you here." The manager looked at Jason as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The guard, now pale, began to back away slowly, realizing that arguing was pointless. "But, sir," the manager started, but Jason cut him off. "I'm not going to repeat myself. You're both fired. I won't tolerate this kind of behavior in my establishment." The manager wanted to protest, but seeing Jason's unyielding gaze, he turned silently and walked away. The guard followed him, casting a brief glance at Mabel, full of fear and regret. But that look no longer mattered. Once they were gone, Jason turned to his mother. His face softened as he took her hand. "Are you all right, Mom?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Mabel nodded, squeezing his hand in return. "Yes, now I am, son," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. They stood at the entrance to the restaurant, and though the incident had ended, Mabel knew this was only the beginning of something bigger. This story of injustice wouldn't end here. News of the incident spread like wildfire. Videos of the event, filmed on smartphones by bystanders, quickly went viral on social media. People commented, shared, and expressed their outrage at seeing an elderly black woman being so cruelly humiliated at the doorstep of her son's restaurant. Countless users began to voice their support for Mabel and praised how Jason had responded to the injustice. In the comments on the video, many remarked that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of the broader issue of racism that permeated society. The footage garnered enormous attention, and soon local news outlets began covering the story. Journalists reached out to Jason for interviews, and several civil rights activists expressed a desire to meet with him and Mabel to support them and draw attention to issues of racial discrimination. Mabel, who had spent years battling the internal wounds caused by countless similar incidents, now found herself at the center of attention. She understood that their story transcended personal drama. It was a symbol that such injustices could no longer be ignored or silenced. Her wounded soul now found peace in knowing that this incident had become a catalyst for an important conversation about problems that had been hidden for decades. Jason, aware of the power of public opinion and the importance of media, decided to use this moment for something bigger than just dealing with the staff. He gave interviews where he spoke about what had happened to his mother and called on society to acknowledge the depth of the problem. He didn't just talk about his restaurant, but also about systemic racism that pervades many areas of life for Black citizens. Jason emphasized that his restaurant would be a place where everyone was respected, regardless of race, and that he would personally ensure that such incidents never happened again. "This isn't just about my mother," Jason said in an interview. "It's about everyone who faces prejudice every day. We can't stay silent anymore. We must fight for justice, and it's our shared responsibility." Mabel, sitting beside her son during the interview, felt that the years of pain and humiliation had finally not been in vain. She saw her son not just defending her, but using this moment to create change. That thought brought her peace. Her heart, once broken by injustice, began to heal slowly, thanks to the solidarity of people, the support of the community, and her son's actions, turning this moment into a powerful statement. With each passing day, support grew, and it became the beginning of a movement for respect and equality that went further than they could have ever imagined. Weeks passed since the incident, and the situation surrounding Jason's restaurant and his mother, Mabel, continued to gain momentum. The support they received turned into something more than just a wave of public outrage. It became a movement for change. Jason and Mabel became symbols of the fight against racial discrimination in society, and their story inspired many others to stand up for their rights. Jason used this opportunity to transform his restaurant, not just into a high-end establishment, but into a place where equality and diversity were valued. He began actively hiring staff from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, ensuring that everyone felt respected and protected at work. The restaurant regularly hosted charity events and campaigns supporting the Black community and other marginalized groups. Local activists and community leaders became regular guests, using the space as a platform for discussing and promoting social justice ideas. Mabel, now the face of this struggle, participated in these events. Her experience and wisdom inspired the younger generation to take action. She often spoke to guests, sharing her stories of a long life full of obstacles and pain, but also of hope for a better future. "We've been through a lot," she said one day at an event. "But this is just the beginning. I always believed that change was possible, even when the world seemed hopeless. Today we see that it's true. We are building a future where our children and grandchildren will live without fear of injustice." Jason and Mabel's story didn't end with the firing of the security guard and manager. This incident marked the beginning of a new era for their restaurant and their lives. Jason's establishment became a hub of cultural activity and unity, where people came not just for food, but to support the ideas of equality and justice. People who once saw the place as just a restaurant now viewed it as a symbol of strength and the fight against discrimination. For Mabel, it was the culmination of her long journey. Throughout her life, she had faced racism. But now, she saw her son become the man who not only protected her, but also changed the world around him. Her heart was no longer filled with bitterness. She found peace, knowing that her struggle had led to change. And though the pain of the past still cast a shadow on her memories, Mabel knew one thing. This new era, an era of justice and equality, had come thanks to her resilience and the strength of her family. Jason had taken up the mission to continue this fight, and now their restaurant had become a symbol of hope for all who had ever faced injustice.